Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's begin today's session of comprehensive news analysis with the first article today that focuses on the impact of climate change on the food crisis burning across the entire world. The author here says that the climate change summits must focus on the food shortages that are happening across the world in view of the changing climatic conditions, which are especially putting the poor income nations at a much greater risk without any fault of theirs. The author says that at the recently concluded Glasgow summit, that was the COP26, a sum of over $350 million was pledged by the developed nations in order to control the impact of climate change. However, to put this into perspective, the problem is so big that this sum is not enough to control the average increase of temperature on the earth. The 2-degree limit that we all talk about will be breached very easily even if this sum is utilized. It is important to note that the 2-degree limit means that the Earth's average temperature should not increase by over 2 degrees Celsius as compared to the pre industrial revolution era temperature. Because the industrial revolution is regarded as the incident after which the average temperature of the earth started to increase. The author says that the aim to end world hunger by 2020 and to control the impact of climate change go hand in hand, since climate crisis and hunger are linked with each other. And the problem has become even worse with the ongoing pandemic. Due to the COVID 19 pandemic, the number of people who are suffering from chronic hunger have increased from 130 million to 270 million across the world. And as per the UN World Food Programme, if we do see a rise of 2 degrees Celsius in the average global temperature, as many as 189 million more people will be under the grip of hunger. Thus, there is an urgent need to take action on the climate front, keeping in mind the food production throughout the world. The most unfortunate part is that the poorest countries who contribute the lowest to climate change are the hardest hit. The author says that the top 10 most food insecure nations don't even contribute 0.1% in the global carbon emission system. But crop failure, water scarcity, their reliance on agriculture is making them much more susceptible as compared to the developed nations. While we have been trying to achieve the aim of a $100 billion contribution from the developed nations towards climate change every year, the UN Secretary General recently said in Italy that the developing countries right now need $70 billion for adaptation, but this figure could very well reach $300 billion before the end of this decade. In this regard, the UN World Programme can play an extremely important role. In 2020, the World Food Programme implemented a climate risk management solution in 28 of those nations which are at the highest risk of food scarcity due to climate change. They prepared the population for such scenarios and they made important changes in their agricultural pattern which helped the people living in those nations. The same program can be done in other countries, including India. The article also throws light on certain possible solutions to tackle this problem. First, the author says that we should create resilient livelihoods, means livelihoods which will not be impacted due to climate change, allowing the people to be able to earn enough and afford food for their family. Secondly, we should adapt to climate change by changing our cropping patterns and opting for more climate resilient food crops such as millets. Thirdly, including women in this entire cycle, making them a part of agriculture and training them on how to grow climate resilient crops could also go a long way. Fourth, people need to be made more knowledgeable about the deep connection between food security and climate change, and both the things should be seen hand in hand. Recently, the UN Special Envoy for Food System Summit also said that in the next COP27, which will be held in Egypt, there should be a special talk on the impact of climate change on food security across the world. Now, the problem of world hunger and malnourishment has been seen over the past few years. Let's go beyond the article and see the official data about the number of people who are malnourished across the world. This data from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, shows that the number of people who are malnourished has actually been on a constant increase since 2014, and the situation has become even worse with the COVID pandemic. The number of undernourished people reached a highest of 821 million in 2017. Not just this, there is also official data from the same organization that tells us about the impact that climate change has on food productivity. As you can see, with increasing number of adverse climatic events, the yield per capita of fields across the world is declining, leading to more people being pushed into poverty and hunger. And the island nations are the ones who are the worst hit because of this problem. In 2009, Maldives held world's first underwater cabinet meeting to draw the attention of the entire world towards a rising water level. In fact, in the recently concluded COP26, you may have noticed Tuvalu minister who gave a speech while standing in the middle of the sea, half submerged, to highlight the fact that the island nations are the worst affected due to climate change. The next article talks about the NIRF ranking, that is, the National Institutional Ranking Framework by the Government of India, that gives a ranking of higher educational institutions across the country. The author here says that there is a fundamental flaw in this ranking system. That is, this ranking system clubs together higher education institutions run by the state government, those which are run by the central government, and those which are considered as institutions of eminence and are given much higher funding. The author says that putting all such institutions into one ranking is extremely unfair, especially on those institutions which are run by the state government, because of the fact that the state governments can't provide enough funding to their universities. Their infrastructure is much weaker as compared to central government institutions, and thus putting them in the same ranking with the IITs and other institutions is very unfair on the state run education institutions. While the center government has much more resources and provides much better funding to the IITs and other central universities, the same cannot be said about the state run universities. Out of 1043 higher education institutions in the country, 184 are central government funded. The author says that the irony is, despite being much lesser supported and having much weaker infrastructure, it is the state public universities that admit most of the students across the country year after year. In fact, it is the state run universities that contribute towards the development of Indian rural areas much more than well known central government institutions. The author says that the people who graduate from IITs and IIMs prefer to go outside India and earn the big bucks, while the students who have graduated from state run universities are the ones who usually go and work in the local economy. And there is no index that measures the impact of these institutions on the basis of what their students are doing after graduating. In fact, there are 420 universities that are located in the rural areas, and their location specific disadvantage is not taken into consideration. These rankings by the Government of India consider five parameters: teaching, learning, and resources, research and professional practice, graduation outcome, outreach and inclusivity, and perception. The author here gives a couple of examples to show why is it that the state run institutions are lagging behind. First, the first parameter, that is teaching, learning, and resources, actually includes the strength of the faculties, faculty to student ratio, how many permanent faculties does the institution have, their qualifications, etc. Hiring adequate number of facilities with good qualifications requires money at the hands of the institute, which is never the case in case of the state run higher education institutions, and that is why they will always lag in such a ranking. Although the number of PhD students in state public universities are the highest amongst all other types of universities, but they are not given the due support required for their research purposes. In fact, the state run universities are even struggling to adopt new technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, computing devices, etc., because of lack of infrastructure and lack of financial support. Thus, it is difficult for them to remain relevant as per the new education policy. The author says that single rankings such as the NIRF should not be taken at face value, and there should be different parameters adopted to rank the state run universities because they deserve a much greater leeway in light of getting much lesser support from the government. At this moment, we will also look beyond the article and see what exactly is the NIRF ranking and why was it launched. This ranking was launched in 2015 by the Government of India to rank higher education institutions in the country. Initially, it was voluntary, but from 2018, all government run education institutions have to participate here and provide the relevant data. This year, about 6,000 institutions have participated in the NIRF. Now, why exactly did the government launch it? You would know there are multiple international rankings such as the QS World University Ranking and the Times Higher Education World University Rankings, where Indian institutions don't usually perform well. One of the reasons is that their parameters for judging a universities were unsuitable for India. For example, they judged on the number of foreign students enrolled in a university in which India never used to rank very high. Thus, the Indian government thought of introducing its own ranking like the Shanghai rankings introduced by China. This is the sixth year of the NIRF ranking, but it only still includes the Indian institutions, while the Shanghai rankings are now international in character and they rank every institution across the world. The long term plan of NIRF is also to make it an international league table, just like the Times Higher Education World University Ranking. Also, it is important to note the recent initiatives taken by the central government to make our higher education sector more attractive. For instance, the government launched the EQUIP program, that is, Education Quality Upgradation and Inclusion Program, for 5 years to improve the quality of our higher education till 2024. The aim is to have at least 50 Indian institutions amongst the global top 1000. The government also launched the Graded Autonomy Program for universities and colleges, meaning that there will be three categories of universities: 1, 2, and 3. Depending upon their performance, first and second category universities will be given a lot more autonomy to run as they want without interference from the government. We also have the GYAN network, that is Global Initiative for Academics Network, under which the government is inviting distinguished academicians, entrepreneurs, and scientists from throughout the world to come to India and teach at our institutions, and they will be paid a handsome amount by the government of India. The next article is about the unfortunate deaths of elephants due to electrocution or train collisions in the past few weeks. This has brought to light the fact that we have still not been able to make our railway crossings safe for our animals. Data has revealed that in the last 11 years, over 1100 elephants have been killed due to electrocution, railway accidents, poaching, and poisoning. Out of this, only 10% deaths have been accounted by poaching, that is, through hunters. The sad part is that there is an easy solution to such problem. For example, installing hanging solar powered fences, which have been planned in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, can be implemented throughout the country. Also, planting citronella and lemongrass to deter the elephants from coming close to railway infrastructure and from dangerous areas can also be done, as is being done in Golaghat district of Assam. However, these initiatives usually only pay dividends when the local community is involved and made a part of it. The local community needs to be made more knowledgeable about the role that the elephants play in biodiversity, and those living near the elephant corridors especially should be sensitized about the issue. The environment and the railway ministry should work together to elevate the wildlife crossings and underpasses for safe passage of the animals so that they don't have to face human traffic. The CAG report has highlighted that wherever underpasses and overpasses have been created by the East Central and Northeast Frontier Railways, there have been no deaths of the elephants. So, this idea can be taken across the country. Let's see some of the other initiatives that the government has taken for conservation of elephants in the country. There have been stringent laws made to arrest poachers and killers of elephants, and multiple elephant reserves have been established across the country in the past few decades. Not just this, the government is also planning to get rid of lantana and eupatorium, which are invasive species and don't let the grass grow for the elephants. Gaj Yatra, which is a nationwide awareness campaign, has been launched to make the people more aware about securing elephant corridors. In 2003, Mike, that is monitoring the illegal killing of elephant program, was also launched to track information about illegal killing of elephants. Apart from that, since 1992, the government has been focusing on Project Elephant for protecting elephants across the country and giving them the technical and financial support needed for conservation of their population. Apart from the religious significance of elephants, elephant also is related to a very interesting bilateral relation story of India and Japan. In 1949, when Japan was still reeling from the impact of the atomic bombs, the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru famously gifted Japan an elephant. This elephant was named Indra, that is, after the daughter of India's first Prime Minister, who later on went on to become India's first female Prime Minister. This elephant Indra was given to Japan as a gift to the children of Japan and was kept at Tokyo's Yuno Zoo. So the story goes that Jawaharlal Nehru received a lot of letters from Japanese children when he was about to visit Japan. In one of the letters, a request was made that please gift an elephant to Japan, and that is what Nehru did while gifting the Indra elephant to Tokyo. The next article is about the government seeking 25,000 crore rupees as a supplementary grant for the Manrega scheme. So the center has sought an additional funding of rupees 25,000 crore for this scheme as a part of the supplementary grant. As you know, the scheme promises 100 days of unskilled work for every household at minimal wages, which is about 210 rupees per day. The reason why the government has had to ask for more funding is that the allocated budget of 73,000 crore rupees for Manrega is already over, and now the payments under the Manrega scheme are being delayed to the people. Interestingly, the experts note that even after 25,000 crore rupees, program will still be short of funds. That is mainly because in the past couple of years, due to the pandemic, the number of jobs given under Manrega have increased considerably since a large number of people have migrated back from the cities to the villages. As you can see from the chart here, states such as Jammu and Kashmir, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh have all already used up the funds allocated to them under the Manrega scheme for this year. Now, the important topic in this article that we would like to focus on is the concept of supplementary grant, which I am sure you would have read in Indian polity. So, let's revise a bit of that. Whenever the government feels that for a particular scheme, the money that they had asked from the parliament in the budget is not sufficient and they require more money for the same scheme, that is when the government goes to the parliament, requests them for the supplementary grant. This is mentioned under Article 115. Article 115 talks about supplementary grant, additional grant, and access grant. The difference being additional grant is for a new service, for a new scheme which was not a part of the budget. Supplementary grant is for an old ongoing scheme where the money is found to be insufficient, while the excess grant is in case the government has already spent more money than was allocated to them. Do remember the details about the access grant. Since the government has already spent additional money than what was granted, such a grant should be approved by the Public Account Committee of the Parliament before being submitted to the Lok Sabha. You would have read about other grants as well, that is the vote of credit, exceptional grant, and token grant. These three come under Article 116. Vote of credit is like an additional amount given to the government, like a blank check, to manage unplanned expenditures. Exceptional grant is when the government requires money for a special purpose, which is not a part of this financial year. And token grant does not require any new money, Token grant just means that the government wants to transfer money from one scheme to the other scheme. Let's assume the government took 6,000 crore rupees for one scheme and 10,000 crore for the other scheme. Now this scheme is over, but government still has 2,000 crore rupees remaining in the pocket from this. So government wants to transfer money from scheme B to scheme A. This is called token grant. Next article for today is about the Australia and Indian government coming close to sealing the early harvest trade deal by the end of this year so that they can go ahead and make a full-fledged free trade agreement by the time the next year arrives. The article says that both the countries under the early harvest trade system would ensure that Australian wines get more access to the Indian markets. Australia's former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who is in India, said that China has been misusing its trade power with other countries across the world, and it is time for India to step up as a substitute in the global supply chain. The tensions between China and Australia actually go way back in 2015. Actually, in 2015, Australia became the first country to publicly ban Huawei, that is a Chinese company, from conducting any 5G trials because it said that the company can't be trusted and they are stealing data and giving it to the Australian government. This did not go well with Australia. Not just this, in the year 2000, Australia joined a group of 14 nations that demanded that China should be investigated for its role in hiding information about coronavirus in the initial months. This step by Australia of accusing China of hiding information on coronavirus led to imposing tariffs worth billions of dollars on Australian trade deals. Thus, the Australian trade was arbitrarily disrupted by China. Since then, the relationship has just gone bad to worse. Post that, the evolution of AUKUS, which is clearly aimed towards China, has also not gone down well with China. Thus, Australia is now looking towards new partners to find a bigger market. Now, let's see what exactly do we mean by early harvest trade. So, usually the early harvest trade deal is a precursor to a free trade agreement. So, before signing a free trade agreement, two countries usually kind of test the waters and provide improved access of their market to each other's products. This is usually called an early harvest trade deal. If all goes well under this, the countries usually go ahead and sign a free trade deal with each other. In 2020, India was Australia's seventh largest trading partner and sixth largest export destination. The good part for India is that we have been successful in cutting down the trade gap that we have between the two nations. We majorly export petroleum products, polished diamonds, medicines, apparels, etc. to Australia, while from Australia we import coal, liquefied natural gas, alumina, and non monetary gold. Australia has also been emerging as one of the favorite hubs of Indians for overseas education and job opportunities. In fact, many people call Australia the mini America for those who can't go to America for India. These are the articles that we wanted to discuss from today's Hindu newspaper. Now, a couple of practice questions. Number one, the Manrega remains crucial for integrated resource management and livelihoods generation perspective. Comment. Second, elephant deaths due to train collisions and electric fences are avoidable with effective policy and implementation. Suggest such policies. Both these questions need to be answered in 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.